Hi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Will Ferris. I'm the copywriting and design assistant at the Poetry Project. I'd like to thank my colleagues Laura, Roberto, Anna, Amanda, and Matt for helping steer the virtual helm. And I'm so grateful to be here tonight sharing space with you all and with Jos Charles. Before we begin the evening's program, I have a few reminders to share. Tonight's moderators are adding a link to the chat now with some helpful Zoom tips and best practices. Please note that we are recording tonight's event. You are welcome to have your camera on or off as you prefer, but I should note that if your camera is engaged, it's possible your Zoom square will end up in the archived recording. Furthermore, if it is of additional comfort or security to you, I empower you to change your name by clicking the three dots at the top right corner of your personal square and selecting Rename. I also want to note that tonight's event is being live captioned by Otter AI, the transcript of which you may access by clicking the red live link in the top left of your screen and selecting View Stream. The transcript will subsequently open in a new browser window. Please note there will be a Q&A after the lecture. So should a question come up to you at any point, please direct it to my colleague Roberto, who you'll see has Q&A after his name. If you have any Zoom questions or run into any difficulties, please don't hesitate to reach out to anyone with staff or moderator after their name, and we'll be glad to get things sorted out. Anna is now adding to the chat a link to our Safer Spaces statement. Whether the room we share and make is virtual or physical, we remain steadfast in building with you all a community and environment that challenges and resists ongoing, imbricated structures of hierarchy and harm. We invite you to join us in this constant and multilateral work, and may we all carry this praxis and ethos with us well beyond this evening. If this evening were taking place as originally imagined, we would be gathered together as has been done for the past 54 years in St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. St. Mark's Church stands on the site of the family chapel of Peter Stuyvesant, built in 1660. In his time as Director General of New Netherland, Peter Stuyvesant began and supervised the direct chattel slave trade to New Amsterdam. He himself enslaved 40 Africans, the most of any person in the colony. These enslaved Africans' stolen lives and labor were used to construct the buildings and streets on this stolen land. St. Mark's Church is located on the unceded homeland of the Lenape people, Lenape-Hoking. I am speaking to you from what is called Harlem, which is the unceded homeland of the Wappinger, a Munsee-speaking band of Lenape people. Anna is now putting this map in the chat, not to endorse it as complete, but to invite us all to learn continually about the land we occupy, its history and ties. As we gather across various neighborhoods and states, it gives me occasion to remember that it's not just some of the land that was stolen or some that needs to be returned, but indeed all of it. It reminds me too that to return the land is not a matter of transferring capitalist ownership, but as many Indigenous thinkers have explained, it's a radical rethinking of belonging and ownership, centering Indigenous autonomy and active relationality and responsibility. When I read Jos Charles's work, I'm reminded of a quote, the origin of which I no longer recall, but in my memory world, I attribute it to Mary Ruefle, that quote, poetry is an etymology, which brings clearly to mind field and its engagement of or against or through Chaucerian English, but also how Jos's poetry and work at large attends to the getting atness and the ghost of the getting atness of language, of the lyric, of the written word. Put another way, reading her work reminds me of Gordon Matta Clark's Anarchitecture, those holes he cut through Pier 52, perhaps to better show the river underneath, perhaps to deliver the pier from its lightlessness, or the light from its peerlessness, or perhaps to change or reimagine our understanding of pier and of light. I should quote Anne Carson because I just stole that reference from her essay, Cassandra Float Can. When I read Jos's work, I think to myself, what is the future doing underneath the past? What I mean is her work looks and reads as such a holy pier, crowded, yes, with absence, displacement, loneliness, loss, but also with people, the natural world, space, desire, and futurity. Coursing underneath, or perhaps all around her work, is this river/field of light, a demand for and herald of a new queer, trans etymology and otherwise, coming at us from the past and the future and somewhere else, which is to also say now. This river/field of light, insisting, listen to me, I have seen a way out, insisting, I mean it, we have always been here. Jos Charles is the author of Field, Pulitzer finalist and winner of the 2017 National Poetry Series, and Safe Space. In 2016, she received the Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Fellowship through the Poetry Foundation. Jos Charles has an MFA from the University of Arizona. She is a PhD student at UC Irvine and currently resides in Long Beach, California. It is a personal and collective joy to welcome Jos Charles to the Poetry Project.
Hello, thank you so much, Will, for that introduction. Can everyone hear me all right? I want to make sure before I get going. Cool. I'm getting the thumbs up. Yes, thank you to Will. Also, thank you to Laura, Amanda, Matt, Anna, and Roberto, to the Poetry Project at large. Thank you, of course, above all, for you all being here. For attending this. Thank you to Claire Schwartz for helping me in editing this. Thank you to JC. Thank you to all the people who I can't mention or couldn't mention, or whose existence stretches beyond the mentioning. You'll have to forgive my rather empty space. I just moved. Relatedly, if I look like this, I keep looking over. I had a Zoom call earlier today, my first Zoom call in this place, and I kept on imagining the whole Zoom call. What would happen if that door just slowly started opening behind me? And it was terrifying. So I may return to that and look upon it. In order to begin speaking of Glissant and what I have learned before at his work, I feel I must start too before it in terms of argument, yet after in terms of time. Especially when thinking through that term relation, which this talk derives its title from. I have to think through intersectionality, this term, or one appropriation of it at least, in order to think through what of relation has been of such use to me as less an alternative and more as a condition of it. A version of intersectionality that sees identity as points, and like a map, attempts to explore and fill in the placement of these points, equivalent in presence, but in different locations. And I'm thinking of this as being similar to, but distinct from relation. Glissant leads us both before and after this map. His use of relation seems to me more like pins on a wall before any totalizing measurement or system, no map drawn in, but also in a way after the map. Series of points left on a wall, a possible appearance of totality imaginable but long since gone, no ground by which to refer to it. A totality imaginable but never drawn in. Perhaps even a pile of ash on the floor, the map that once was, a remnant of something failed, something gone. Rhetorics of identity often take the shape or use or utilize spatial metaphors. Intersectionality, as I had mentioned, for instance, conjures lines, cross-sections, identifiable, multiple definable crosshatches, equally clear elisions. There are points, positions, given as legible, with clear reference, even as the referent might change, with a kind of fixed presence. In this model, it is not a question of reach, like, say, a parabola or some other something forever reaching towards an asymptote, which is kind of abstraction and nothingness that it will never reach, but lines forever crossing with definite points, extension, measurement, like reaching down to measure the length of a floorboard. This is an immediate metaphor. You can see where I got it. I just moved in. Not all treatments of identity need necessarily be so caught up with presence and measurement, certainly, but the language and its metaphors can at times enable or encourage it. It is not only identity, though, but the political more broadly, which is spoken of as measurable in this way. A varied deployment of violences and power, with as varied a deployment of resistances, all legible, understandable, strengthened by an analogizing of these points or positions as equivalent. By way of example, let's consider a brief passage of Simone de Beauvoir's treatment of identity in the introduction of The Second Sex. Well, as with all examples, exemplary of this kind of measurement and equivalence. And this is an extended quotation, quote, "For the native of a country, inhabitants of other countries are viewed as, quote, foreigners. Jews are the, quote, others for anti-Semites, Blacks for racist Americans, Indigenous people for colonists, proletarians for the property classes. These phenomena could not be understood if human reality were solely a mit sign based on solidarity and friendship. On the contrary, they become clear if, following Hegel, a fundamental hostility to any other consciousness is found in consciousness itself. The subject posits itself only in opposition. It asserts itself as the essential and sets up the other as inessential, as the object. Difference certainly exists here." Oh, this is me now. End quote. "Difference certainly exists here. But all these positions are shown as having a kind of equivalence too. They all operate according to an opposition as if the same for Beauvoir. Each is like each through an act of metaphor, a poetic act. Suffering may have its differences, maybe, it's not really mentioned here, but at least this kind of polarity, oppressor to oppressed, is measurable as equivalent, is figurable as equivalent. This is how I mean equivalence in presence. The oppressed is negated, that the oppressor might be posited. These positions are dialectical, i.e., we could say by analogizing further, the trans woman needs the cis woman in order to become a trans woman as a kind of promise or claim that is denied. The two poles are identifiable as poles, alike in their polarity and their attachment, yet distinct in their placement within it. Beauvoir goes as far as invoking a Heideggerian Mitsein, just being with, even as she's critical of it. In short, the one who resists, or carrying the example above, the trans woman posits herself against a subject she cannot be allowed to be, a position different, opposite, even as the presence of each is the same. It is by such opposition resistance might form, or at least enable, the articulation of the position of the other, as resisting the polarity it has been pulled into. Beauvoir goes on, quote, "We will then attempt to positively demonstrate how, quote, feminine reality, unquote, has been constituted, why woman has been defined as other, and what the consequences have been from men's point of view. Then we will describe the world from the woman's point of view, just as it is offered to her, and we will see the difficulties women are up against just when, trying to escape the fear they have been assigned until now, they seek to be a part of the human Mitsein." End quote. Just feels yucky saying human Mitsein. Okay. Well, let's move past thinking of the woman as something universal here, white and cis, which is a very, very big thing to move past, because there's much to be critical of in this. But in order to continue this kind of rhetorical analysis of spatial metaphors at work here, the woman, by being put into a subordinate position, has the possibility of self-discovery and determination now. By being in a position, she can speak back to power, as people are fond of saying. Inversion becomes possible. The assignment is named and therefore able to be struggled, against another with. Clear, organization becomes possible, revolution becomes possible, the transfer of power becomes possible, utopia, dictatorship of the proletariat, and so on. There are critiques to be levied. This is very European and very white and very essentializing. It is not exactly what we'd call intersectional. Plus, this is all a rather unfortunate situation to be stuck in. These rules of the game, the language of the oppressor, his or her metaphysics. Beauvoir is arguing for a kind of equivalence, appealing to it, so that the wheel might turn, a new position equal in presence and legibility and so on might be on top, able to self-determine. The articulation of the subordinate's position as if equivalent to the oppressor is through an act of resistance or insurgence, requires much struggle and to even be able to make the claim, to be raised to some kind of equivalent consciousness or power or being. I give this example to direct back to our opening, more so than to shit talk Beauvoir, though we could, of course, but to use this passage as a kind of shorthand for one account of identity. Even as these forms of oppression can be spoken of as different, they all are equally available to be demonstrated within the same language of position, line, figure. This is, or so it seems to me, essentially the same framework, the same metaphors people at times use today. A rhetoric of charting, discovery, mapping the playing field in order to attempt to address the multiplicities of such polarities the subject may be caught within. In a kind of bad faith intersectionality, that is something appropriate out of, for example, the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who across her work calls attention again and again to intersectionality as a strategy, as a way of performing triage and a metaphor, i.e. how to address social issues intersectionally rather than it being an identity within a theoretical framework. We can see a kind of recuperation of measurement, equivalence, and spatial metaphor in some treatments of it, not hers. As an example, let's consider, this is silly, but the Wikipedia definition of intersectionality, not again as an authority, but as exemplary. Intersectionality is the theoretical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. Examples of these aspects are gender, caste, sex, race, class, sexuality, religion, disability, physical appearance, and height. Intersectionality identifies advantages and disadvantages that are experienced by people due to a combination of factors. These intersecting and overlapping social identities may be both empowering and oppressing. End quote. It goes on, but it gets worse. We have different aspects able to be put alongside each other as examples of identity, as sites of discrimination and privilege. Discrimination may very well be moral here, i.e. there's no mention of history, what generates this effect or symptom called discrimination. So too with privilege, which is just another position. Some people are privileged in one way, but not in another, discriminated against in one way, but not in another. Here, intersectionality is less a strategy for aid, as in Crenshaw, and an entire theoretical framework for accounting for identity as such. It is a measurement, a third thing to reference, to affix to, which might structure the encounter of two people, two parties, whatever, in an ethical or political way. Another example. I bend to the floor to measure the length of a room, so that I know if a rug will fit. It is however many inches, and so is the rug. All is well. This is very useful. It's relatively clear in this exchange. I know inches are made up, or I'm using them very functionally toward a very specific task. The history of inches, say in relation to the metric system or its life historically, libidinally, something, I don't know, i.e. why inches or how inches, withdraws from me. This is good. I just want a rug to fit in my room, right? But that doesn't mean why or how are bad questions, just irrelevant to the task at hand. The question why one measures, how one does, in what language, in reference to what, for which tasks, and for who, for others, whether or not there ought to be others, and so on, are in fact fairly important questions. All this is covered up in the day-to-day use of inches, which slowly sediments and naturalizes itself here in the States where I am. One almost starts to believe an inch is something fixed because it ought to be, rather than because it's circumstantial, convenient cultural development that happens to be ready to hand. The scope of identity is, of course, a bit more charged here. Identities are not given ex nihilo, but made up. They are sustained, they are undone, they change, they are being made anew. They beat out according to a kind of rhythm, according to lots of bad, terrifying things, noticeably absent from our Wikipedia article. Granted, it is a Wikipedia article and not a psychopolitical account of why and how identities are made. Yet, this definition presents a lot of metrics and measurements of identity as strictly spatial, that is, able to be abstracted outside of time, as fixed, outside how things unfold and for whom and in relation to what. A quick Google search of intersectionality shows this as well, a whole series of Venn diagrams and charts and maps. To cover up why and how, to naturalize this, because a great deal more than the example of inches, right? And it's here, what it is that is wanted, what is dreamed or desired of measurement, I'd like to turn. You're probably thinking of it now, I am. Okay. Before getting back to Glissant, though, I'd like to think with a few other thinkers first. There is this one passage in Frantz Fanon that I return to regularly that has always struck me as a kind of alternative to these spatial metaphorics by incorporating them into a temporal dimension as well, by uniting them in this example of tempo. In this passage, Fanon takes up rhythm and tempo as guiding, determining the broader context under which positions become identifiable or legible. There's something or someone beating time out. Measurement is guided by history and desire. Content is knowable still here, but it unfolds according to a time which orders it, in accordance with the withdrawn velocity driving it. Fanon makes the brief aside in Algeria Unveiled, drawing from his psychoanalytic practice. Quote, whenever in dreams having neurotic content, a European man meets an Algerian woman, the specific features of his relations with the colonized society manifest themselves. These dreams evolve neither on the same erotic plane, nor at the same tempo as those that involve a European woman, end quote. Fanon manages to hold to the plane and tempo, positionality, temporality, but also this kind of velocity as exemplified in rhythm. Even as the dream is a manifestation of political relation, the political and psychoanalytic seem to follow a kind of tempo revealed within the dream. It is the form in which, temporally, spatially, completely, the political seems to articulate itself, even as it's a manifestation or a consequence of it. The dream is a manifestation of a political landscape that itself follows a tempo marked out in dream. The word I think of here is anterior, with an A, anterior, as in something before, right? Before another. This is not quite like facing or to encounter face to face, equally, spatially. Again, this drama of equivalency, alterity, but spatially before as well as temporally before, to in every sense come before another. What is so curious, at least to me, in the Fanon, is that even as this tempo is anterior, temporally and spatially before the political playing field, the dream it occurs within is entirely a manifestation of the political. This is kind of circular motion to it, or a spiral. Desire, in other words, is a cause that is also a consequent of its own effect. An aesthetic desire, learned from the political, builds up into this unconscious dream world which upholds, extends, builds that very political world. This is also, in, of course, a less charged way, like our example with the rug. Imagine if there was no system of measurement available to the person laying out the rug, or perhaps, and more realistically, a lack of a tape measure or something needed to measure the thing out. Maybe one uses their hands or feet or some other thing to measure out. The whole system of measurement, in other words, is made up for the task, which retroactively becomes articulated, legible by the system which was made up for it. I think here of Gayatri Spivak, who uses the term metalepsis to refer to a similar process. That is, when an effect of an effect seems to substitute itself as the cause. For Spivak, the author or the subject effect is a prime example of this. Quote, a subject effect can be briefly plotted as follows. That which seems to operate as a subject may be part of an immense continuous network, text in the general sense, of strands that may be termed politics, ideology, economics, history, sexuality, language, and so on. Each of these strands, if they are isolated, can also be seen as woven of many strands. Different knottings and configurations of these strands, determined by heterogeneous determinations, which are themselves dependent upon myriad circumstances, produce the effect of an operating subject. Yet the continuous and homogeneous deliberative consciousness symptomatically requires a continuous and homogeneous cause for this effect, and thus posits a sovereign and determining subject. This latter is then the effect of an effect, and it's positing a metalepsis, or the substitution of an effect for a cause. End quote. This Spivakian metalepsis is not unlike our example from Fanon. We see a host of spatial terms, strands, weavings, which are given a kind of originary knot, which is in fact their effect. This is authorship in the text as much as identity and the political. The origin is an effect of an effect, a substitution. I also think this is somewhat like monuments. The monument too creates its history, right? Even as it's said to invoke it. A kind of authorship. One constructs a statue in order to justify the history of the statue, right? It makes this history rather than being caused by it. This interior process, this metalepsis, this tempo, does not upset or trouble the political. It is precisely how it is guaranteed and enabled here. There would be no history, its monumentalization, no subject without this sort of retroactively, interiorly posited thing. This all relates to poetry for me because here too, literally, rhythm is experienced temporally before meaning, right? I.e., one feels the pulse and sonics which order meaning before the meaning arrives, which upon arrival seems to have fulfilled or guaranteed that rhythm in the first place. Poetry is wholly concerned with this kind of anterior relation, the way an aesthetic commitment to what is pleasurable, what sounds pleasurable, scripts what semantic meaning is possible, even as that meaning is then, after the fact, given a denotative meaning. Or, perhaps more accurately, the reader herself gives over to the poem a kind of faith, an anticipation of meaning, which allows for the rhythm to unfold as if towards some kind of discovery, even as that arrival may never occur. For my purposes, this is what the lyric is. And if this talk had a thesis, and I am not sure that it does, it would be that the lyric exploits, and I use this word painfully, the rhythms, the monuments, the beats it makes. Thus, repetitions, quasi-repetitions, returns, rhymes, slant rhymes, refrains, and so on. Like this statue to history, the poem is continuously re-inaugurating itself, its existence, its meaning, a way of making itself continuous with itself. It's libidinal. These repetitions all attempt to make something to hold to, something like a statue, a material that ceases to be material when spoken of again, a way to orient and enter, replacing, displacing the thing invoked. Now, admittedly, poetry works this way simply because language works this way. A sentence starts, and in an act of good faith, we presume it knows where it's heading, or at least the so-called author does, how it will end up. This working can be good, sure, but also very, very violent. It depends entirely upon the sentence, who is speaking to whom, and the broader situation. In any context, though, this guiding implantment, a mess of libidinal attachments, a history relegated to the category of aesthetics, how words sound and feel and where they came from and what gets quantified as music and whose music and the music of language, a kind of exhalation, wearing down of strings, stretch of dead skin on drum, is always being covered up in this process with semantic meaning, the creation of something withdrawing in order to resonate, an impossibility made possible, always being made possible, the limit of a life wearing itself to death, the logic of elegy. I know I am risking obfuscation here. My hope is by risking one kind, I avoid another, one I see as more dangerous, a certain day-to-day normal obfuscation. I also have been speaking myself rather interiorly, right? Anticipating what is not a surprise, but a fulfillment of the talk to begin with, namely Glissant, who I had almost a year prior set out to write and talk about with you today. I turned to the critical work of Édouard Glissant as he established, across genres, decades, a lexicon which consistently moves away from terminologies of relation being a priori constructed by historical or political ground and grounded in those metaphorics of space, towards an aesthetic one. It's neither outside nor exemplary of the political, but as I've been nudging us towards, anterior to it. In the early, albeit seminal, Poetics of Intention, Glissant writes, quote, "To be born into the world is at last to conceive, to live the world as a relation, as a composed necessity, a consenting reaction, a poetics and not a morality," end quote. The contrast is between consent and poetry on one side, that consenting faith I spoke of or tried to, that the reader gives over to the author, and a kind of ethico-systematic thinking on the other. In Poetics of Relation, which is over 20 years later, he writes, quote, "Recognition of the other is not a moral obligation, but an aesthetic constituent of that relation," end quote. Recognition is aesthetic. It's shot through with desire and its history, its creation, who demands it, what form it must or must not take, for whom, and whose language, and so on. Rather than two positions, each equal in presence, transparent in a similar way, knowing how they fit according to an external measurement, Glissant points to this aesthetic constitution of the encounter to begin with. Upon arrival, there is already something like a manifestation of tempo and dream, what has been imagined and desired from the encounter, consciously or not. This ties into that frequent term of Glissant's, opacity. Opacity is what withdraws, that which cannot be reduced, the ash piled up where a map once was, or who knows, maybe it was never a map, but some remnant of something else that occurred, something irreducible. What the skin of the drum covers, which only exists by way of the covering. In poetry, this withdrawn content, I believe, and why I use the word lyric here, is this kind of music that has become abstracted out of poetry. Of course, poetry is a kind of music, as language is a kind of music. Sounds arranged for a kind of pleasurable exchange with rhythms, pitch, and so on. Language communicates, but also according to a tempo. But somewhere, and this is another project way beyond our scope here, meaning became abstracted. In Europe, in the West, in English, I honestly don't know. As if communication wasn't present in music, as if it were distinct from music. Poetry was said to have lost some kind of music, the lyre. This is all very Victorian, by the way. Some imagined continuity with the Greek past, a trademark of that same kind of Victorian modernist white historiography, with the instrument forever lost, or the eternal music forever lost, or the music of the spheres forever lost, or whatever it is, withdrawing from it, while nonetheless animating it. The lost history that the statue points to. That this privileged position was apportioned to poetry as the one place in language music was not ousted from, but resided in a withdrawn way, is certainly strange. Songs exist after all. Music still exists, plenty of pleasurable musical ways of speaking. All ways of speaking, in fact. The same faith the listener gives the speaker that a sentence heads towards an end which will fulfill it, close it, and guarantee meaning also animates poetry. For whatever reason, it is more readily noticeable, acceptable, taught within poetry, but this is kind of a digression. As that kind of music is said to withdraw from poetry, so too much withdraws from the subject, much that isn't reducible to semantic meaning or content, and in fact is what structures that content. To continue running with the one example, the hollow of the drum is precisely what resonates the drum, right? It's what gives the visible skin its resonance. This faith I spoke of is consent for Glissant. And one, in encounter, consents not only to the opacity of oneself, what is unknowable in oneself, but to this opacity of the other. The opacity of the other is a phrase that occurs throughout Glissant's work. The ethicosystem, which we can tie in with a fixed positional kind of thinking, semantic meaning making, assumes a self-reflexivity of thought that Glissant, as with our finale example, or psychoanalysis or psychopolitics points to as well, contends. Not only is one not transparent to oneself, what I don't notice about myself, but one is also enmeshed with others and without others. Not just what I notice or don't about them, but what they do or don't notice about themselves. One is not merely what one tells oneself, nor what one doesn't tell oneself, as per Freud, I guess, nor yet other which confounds in the way she knows or may not, or may not tell. This is Levinas's alterity. But one is too, as Glissant writes, quote, the fallow aspect, the unconscious, the unknown and excessively known part of the other, end quote. It's poetics of intention as well. Attending to this fallowness, the opacity of another, or attempting to, even as it remains, as it must, imaginative and fantastical is for me the closest to a definition of lyrical, not diction, but lyrical attentiveness I can offer. It is precisely because this fallow aspect withdraws, is unknown, or is given as unknown, that an active imagination is able to lyrically encounter the possible unknown excess of the other of the world. In the poetics of relation, this often takes the language of errancy. Writing of an ideal poetics of relation, Glissant writes, quote, one who is errant, who is no longer traveler, discoverer, or conqueror, strives to know the totality of the world, yet already knows he will never accomplish this, and knows that this is precisely where the threatened beauty of the world resides. To encounter the world, in other words, is to offer over to the world, to give to it a sense of totality. Here we might say the political, the measurable. Glissant always uses totality in a rather idiosyncratic way. Even as each individual component of that totality slips away into the unknown, the opaque, the impossible, which the imaginative and hermeneutic force of encounter attempts to fill in. To this, we might add, however, that when not errant, when conquered, the same process is occurring, just merely as an act, an imaginative act of capture, transference, mastery. Violence is often motivated, right, by what one imagines is obscure in the other, or opaque or withdrawn. It's not good, it's structural. The history of the lyric, or a lyric, I should say, no more so than the English lyric, which has its conquerors, of course, and its errant too, full of its own fallow grounds, bears these kinds of violences out. There is good faith as well as bad faith. Neither party, the errant nor the conqueror, has left the imaginative realm. Merely one brings to light, arranges, places, reorders, imagines, fills in, with no regard for consent, while the other, the prior, recognizes that the other is the imaginative totality, right, of the other, and passes by with or without a word, together or not, known or unknown, given over to a kind of consensual and indifferent faith. What allows for encounter, what resonates it, is this opacity of the other for Glissant. Relation, as Glissant writes in The Philosophy of Relation, quote, does not posit any of our moral principles. It's up to us to write them into it, via a very individual effort of both mind and our imaginary representations of the world. Importantly, though, I do not think this is unique to poetry for Glissant, but that poetry merely has come to be made to exemplify this more general and lyric fact of language, as we too were considering earlier. Continuing in poetic intention, he writes, Relation, quote, is not in effect a language of communication, but on the other hand, a possible community, and if possible, regular, between mutually liberated opacities, differences, languages, end quote. The strategy, capacity of lyric attention becomes possible precisely because in such moments of encounter, this attention opens up and imagining attends to in an act of imagination what is unsaid. Encounter as such is structured less like a narrative here in Glissant, which orders, settles, and more like a poem, with co-occurrences, multiple logics of line and sentence, speech and writing, record and memory, reader and speaker. Which I also say not to talk narrative, right? This is not apolitical. Poems' encounters are often horrid. The examples of these are many and reflected throughout Glissant. That this kind of lyrical attendance can disempower and empower for close relations while enabling ones is far from utopian. It's pre-utopian, pre-ethical, pre-political. Relation is what is anterior to the political, to ethics. Merely and only the relation is there, already composing, remaining, following Fred Moten here, not in between, but distinctly and wholly in each, speaker and reader, a self and world, made resonant by all that is not known, cannot be known, or too known within the other. To return to the lyric, one is able to identify a coherent lyric, whatever content might fill that in, precisely because this relational gesture of giving over on behalf of the encounterer or reader, this totality of the work that the reader imagines is promised to them, which it is, but only in the imagining and giving, an attentiveness towards meaning, an impossible reaping of the fallowness of the text, a text which might never appear, an imagined thing very much not in the individual author, that the lyric becomes identifiable. It is this not in-between relational thing, prior to the political, the logic of conquering and discovering meaning, which is lyric reading. Even as Glissant's critical work, which was engaged here, is more and more in English context engaged, treatments of Glissant's poetic work remain fewer. Even in the more canonical treatments of Glissant within English, say, for example, within J. Michael Dash's vital contextualizing work of Glissant's vast earth, Glissant's poetics is portrayed as, quote, indeterminate and, quote, avoiding the predictable themes of race or anti-colonial polemic, end quote. Even so much so when Dash does treat the section in particular, which is forthcoming, Boises, Dash reads the work in a chapter devoted to the novel Malmo, discussing it briefly to clarify Glissant's relation to local Martinique politics and broader ideas of globalization. Boises, however, plays out numerous of the ideas roughly sketched above, much clearer, or at least so it seems to me, than in, this talk, and in some of the critical work. Consider even the opening section of Boises, entitled Prose. These translations are mine, but for want of translation. When dream calves only a bundle of roses, cleaves a shriek of ember and star, fused, two written out, we press language out, fallen long ago to its ravine, like one raving limps into a mangrove, stiffer than thorned in wood, more insufferable than wooded in. By way of an aside, the word used here, boise, so like the title of the collection, so boise, is used here communicating a nexus of potential meanings, in addition to the repetition of bois, bois, boise within the poem. While used here as an act of yoking, hitching, wooding in, the meaning of boise is referring, quote, to the wooden collars worn by slaves should be noted as well. And this was a quote, not my words. It is dream which is active in constituting the layout, what emerges as scenic within the poem. This recalls Fanon. Language, meanwhile, is overdetermined, too written out, too pressed out. Dream, though, is also in excess of any attempt at being wooded in, harder, less flexible than the violence of containment. It is not language or violence that is active, but this aspirational kind of violence, which is determining how it might appear. This doesn't make liberatory projects or insurgents futile, right, for Glissant, but necessitates them. They merely are another action too motivated by dream, by affect, by desire, imagination, fantasy, which is totalizing and given over an encounter. The flippant yet certain turn in language, which is another section of that same poem, serves as a stark example. Star grinds the letter down. The city ballot box. All no papers coming up, yes. Certain, Monsieur Lisberry's secret. Ah, for a flintstone. Here we have a civic political scene of voting, right, which becomes interrupted, is guided to be interrupted, seen as almost only fulfillable in this ending on the flintstone, which is for what, right? To start a fire, to light the votes, to keep warm, to burn down, to throw through a window. The overall shape of the series moves the reader from this sort of mythopoetic birth scene and prose through multiple scenes of local, global scenes of colonial violence, only to lead us to perhaps this stark development of relation within Glissant's work, within country. While Glissant exemplifies what relation is throughout his earth, straightforward definitions are rare. In country, the scenic fragments, which I'll read forthcoming, all connect, seem to relate each to each other, while also putting the reader in the seat of the encounter, enabled to imagine precisely the relation of these terms, both in what maintains them and what could narrativize or link them. The poem utilizes a series of ins, as you'll hear, and this will be my closing, which asks of the reader to imagine the relation of their parts. As I hope by now, or I've tried to impress, this is not unique. Every sentence assumes a reader is suturing its parts, but what is unique is the power, consent, power of consent, frankly, that Glissant acknowledges the reader is having. Writing of the collection Boises, Jonathan Monroe describes this as, quote, an appositional poetics, which is post-oppositional, as it enables, quote, the play of the imagination to take up and become other than, not simply to oppose past poetic practices, end quote. Thinking again of Moten, and this is on lyric painting. This is like the appositional collision he outlines of the lyric itself, quote, a complex recasting of the dialectic that seems to ring true here with Glissantian totality. In this piece, which closes out the series, by having removed the explicit relation, any mastery of said relation from the syntax of the sentence itself, the reader is put into a position to imagine precisely what relates the appositional lines to each other. It's not covered up. One encounters a kind of bare relation of scenes. The reader must imagine relation, though again, not as exceptional, but exemplary of meaning-making. Glissant seems to hand the right to imagine relation right back to the reader, where it has always been, as the hand that fashions meaning, the political life of the poem. The poem in its very strictures is set up to imagine a totality, even as the relation of each part remains opaque, withdraws from the poem itself. It's almost like Glissant is writing rhythm only, ash only. The imagining, the attending to the fallowness, which necessitates new measurement, new configurations, is presented. The old measurements will not do here. It is newer, it is softer than that. Or, as country tells us, it is in preciosity, the poem, the lyric, relation comes. Contingent, open. I will end with Glissant's words, as they are much more useful and clear than my own. I also want to take this opportunity to thank you all again for attending this, hearing my few comments, nothing more than commentary, trailing behind the thinkers included, many thinkers not included, the many who have yet to be legible as included or not. Country. In the alley south of here, in briny morning frost, in the energy of clay, earthing destiny up, in the wavering flats of palms, in the voice, water spouts in deserts of infinity, in echo without crash or wave, in the asking for alms, in a cut deep into green darknesses, in mud, loosing bamboo from cement, and in an old man, nude, watching lightning through the night, in a body unearthed by freighters, in crawling under, in a driver gone mad, leaving his pale tractor behind, in preciosity, in the jowls of a lying and political fish, in the alarm at the heart of rock, your whole heart, where all earth comes to you. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Jos. You say in the talk that your thesis, if there were to be one, is this. The reader gives over the poem to the poem a kind of faith and anticipation of meaning, which allows for the rhythm to unfold as if towards some kind of discovery, even as that arrival may never occur. And among much else, that to me is what we've done here tonight, a good faith promise between us and you that we'll get to the thing. Or put another way, we'll pass or mark time and make meaning. We measured the room to see if the rug would fit. Yeah, so thank you. I'm so grateful. And now we'll have a Q&A. And as I stated before, if any questions come to you, please direct them to Roberto, who has a Q&A affixed next to his name. And I suppose I will start us off. I have so many questions, gosh. So I suppose I feel like much of this talk sort of lives alongside like translation and the experience of translation as well. And for that matter, I was so excited that you said that this that was your translation of Boises. But anyway, like I feel like translation is this sort of promise that like the kernel that I'm handing to you is indeed at its essence the same one as the one that I had to begin with, though the pulp or pith around it may be different. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on further thoughts on the relationship between translation and the lyric, or anything about translation in general that you wish to speak to.
Yeah, so as I'm reading this, I also have footnotes that and other comments that I'm not reading. But translation is spoken of, you know, and I'm a novice. I'm not a scholar of Glissant at all. This is not necessarily my field, but there is, let me find it. This is in the introduction of Poetry of Diversity. Glissant says of translation, quote, "What every translation suggests in essence via the passing from one language to another that is intrinsic to it is the preeminence of all the languages of the world. And translation for this very reason indicates and offers us proof that we must conceive in our imaginations this totality of languages." So similarly, right, as for Glissant, totality seems to be something imagined rather than something given or something fixed. It's an act of imagination based upon encounter, which ought to always be consensual, right? So one could imagine consensual translation, right? Also, creating this imagined totality of languages, which enables these kind of, some of the universalizing and generalization I do as well about language as such or something, right? I don't know if I really have tons of thoughts on it. I think it is a thought, though, that stimulated Glissant, who has been mentioned. Yeah, I guess that's how I will answer that. It's not really much of an answer, but to say, one has to struggle with that, right, in translation. One has to struggle with what it is that is total, that is communicable in the poem or whatever is being translated. Which is difficult. Yeah, because it is imagined. It doesn't exist, right? It's not given. It's not fixed. Yeah, I have immense respect for consensual translators.
As do I. I suppose this is moving it in a slightly different direction, but I was struck by this line somewhere, I think in the middle of the lecture, a quote, or maybe a quote. The monument too creates the history. It says it invokes a kind of authorship. One constructs a statue in order to justify the history of the statue, or rather justify the history the statue in fact is making. And I was thinking about this sort of vis-a-vis your poetry, but in particular one that's like kind of a deep cut, but it had me thinking of this poem you wrote about, or like on the occasion of the Stonewall 50th anniversary, and the closing line, which goes, quote, "When we meet again, I will tell you when they tear down a house, they build a statue of a house." And I suppose this is sort of not outside the scope of the lecture, because I think one of my takeaways from this lecture was that nothing is outside the scope of anything, but I'm wondering if you had any further thoughts about anything in this world, either that particular poem or what else am I thinking about? I'm thinking about Stonewall, I'm thinking about history, I'm thinking about particularly queer and trans history and also queer and trans historiography. And yeah, I'll lay that onto you.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, these two moments are connected for me explicitly. What was I reading? I was reading something gross. A lot of my poems seem to come from me reading something and going, "That's gross." Jean-Luc Nancy. Why I was reading Nancy, I don't know. How Nancy got in my pajamas. Okay. Yeah, so I was reading Jean-Luc Nancy, and there was this thing about monuments that was frustrating. It was very kind of just anti-communist, counter-revolutionary nonsense. So, and it made me mad. But it was about monuments and about this kind of thing, and it was thinking of, I guess, like sort of what Nancy was seeing as like a Stalinist cult of personality or something. And I had read that around the same time that I was offered this very generous thing, yeah, from Museum of Modern Art Houston to work on something related to this. Meanwhile, I live in Long Beach, and there is this plaza called Harvey Milk Plaza, which for a time was a sort of grove, I guess. It had a circle of trees that had citrus fruits, it had benches, and many people here in Long Beach who are unhoused lived there, right? Then one day, the city put, its blue walls up, because development has to happen unseen. But they have to let you know that it's happening, right? And it got replaced with like a big flat slab of concrete. No trees, no benches, except for one of those, defensive architecture kind of benches that one could rest on. And that's when it was retermed Equality Plaza. And so I was thinking about sort of all the things that you just mentioned, Will. How, I mean, just the very fact that there's a Harvey Milk Plaza, right? In a place, so like the kind of place that killed Harvey Milk. And I don't even particularly care about representation within US electoral politics or whatever. But like, it's just so many ironies. It's mind-boggling. Yeah, and it was literally this, and literally tore down houses to put up a statue about how they don't tear down houses, right? And that's similar to that kind of monumentalizing history, right? It becomes more important to narrate sort of position, justification, continuity. We are continuous with Harvey Milk, not with, I don't remember, the other senator or politician who shot Harvey Milk, right? Even though they're both of the same body. We get to choose who we are continuous with, and we get to reject who we are not continuous with. And I don't have, this is not to critique as a Contemporary Art Museum of Houston, sorry, I misspoke earlier. Not at all, but there is, right, also a kind of historiography of Stonewall that does exactly this as well. Where cops will clear out the street for a Stonewall parade to happen or whatever, right? It's just these ridiculous contradictions. Yeah. So I was thinking of this and thinking around these things. I think you're right to identify them.
Thank you. And I suppose something else I was thinking, or that struck me, or that I was thinking about, is there's this moment in your talk where you're discussing how a poem like sort of necessarily lives in or is constituted by the anterior. As you say, rhythm is experienced before meaning, right? And later, a bit later, I'll quote, thus repetitions, quasi-repetitions, returns, rhymes, slant rhymes, refrains, and so on is like the statue to history, the poem continuously reinaugurating its existence, its meaning, a way of making itself continuous with itself. And I suppose I was struck by this because I was also thinking about, yes, the like experience of reading a poem, but I was also thinking of the optics of a poem and like the experience of literally seeing a poem on the page before you even like get to the moment of language. And I was like, so specifically line breaks and also how lines are placed on or across the page. And I bring this up because I'm always struck and surprised by how your poems are arranged on the page, and was wondering if you had any thoughts on optics in poetry at large, or either in your work, and like how they like sort of have a hand in the meaning making or in their like relationality of a poem?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, with respect to my work, I think about this definitely. I think the way in which form is given or talked about doesn't always resonate with me, and I tend to think through connotation and reference. So yeah, like the first poem, for instance, that opens Field, and I know I don't have this before me, and I'm not necessarily here to talk about that work, but it's very blocky with like one kind of line shooting outside of it. And I was thinking of the cantos. I was thinking of Pound, that grand old asshole Pound. And I was thinking about how those poems look on the page. This kind of like epic format, but that has been like also a reference to like maybe it's like Sappho or something where there are these gaps, right, as well. Like pieces have been lost, and yet you're still presented with this kind of like very formal epic, I'm going to narrate the world to you kind of stance. And so for me, yeah, I was like, oh, I love this idea of beginning this collection this way, and with this trumpets blaring. And then there's this one line that sort of shoots out of it, you know, the saddened powers we rub so economically, right? Which sort of, I guess, commentary on why it looks the way it looks. I give this not to toot my own horn because, you know, whatever, if it's a useful poem, it's a useful poem. If it's not, it's not, and that's all well and good. But I say this more optics of the poem versus form. Yeah. The way in which like there's a kind of surveillance of the poem, what it looks like, how it shows up, what counts and doesn't count, and so on. That felt for me in Field very resonant with just going out and about in the world, and how one's body was surveilled, right? Trying to think of an example. So like I'm here in Long Beach. I grew up in Orange County, in Santa Ana specifically, which is very conservative. Orange County is, I mean. Yeah, they like send their Huntington Beach militias up here and, you know, bother people now and so on. It's this kind of Trump area. So walking down the street, when I was presenting in a way that they didn't like, they made it known, right? There was no need to have outside surveillance, right? They surveilled themselves. It was already being done. You know, and people would, whatever, call things or throw things or whatever. I don't need to catalog the kind of violence and trauma we all know, or we don't know, and in which case, you know, you should notice it. But yeah, I was thinking of this, that there is this kind of way in which one is making these immediate assumptions just based upon the glance, the shape, the distance. And also how that, right, contrasts with voice. How, for instance, maybe I would pass as a cis woman, and then I would speak and I would not. And then that's when shit can get real bad. So, because then there's a turn when it goes from just being routinal misogyny to transmisogyny. So like that kind of turn, I guess I'm thinking through somewhat with my poems, and seems present to me in all poems. That kind of, you have a first glance stock account of something, and that impulse to do so is not always good. Yeah. I'm not saying particularly much that your question didn't already say, but these are sort of my thoughts around it, I guess.
Thank you. I appreciate your thoughts around it.
Thanks.
I suppose, thanks for indulging my scattered questions, the pins on the wall, as you said, I think.
Yeah.
We have one question from Radiance Kia Christina, which I'll read. They say, I got lost in the capacity/opacity of the resonating hollow under the skin of the drum. What opacity can you elucidate?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So like a drum is often, whether it's hollow at the bottom or not, some kind of like, you have to create some kind of space, right? Some kind of hollowness in order for this thing to get stretched across, that when you hit it, it resonates, right? Because if you just have like, I don't know, this on its own, it's not going to make much of a sound, right? But if it was stretched across something with a kind of body, with a kind of hollowness, with a kind of inside, it would resonate, right? And this is like, I'm using it as a kind of stand-in, I guess, for music generally. This is also true of like a plucked instrument or an instrument that you blow air through. It's something very, very tiny, resonating something hollow, to amplify or to give it a character or to give it timbre, some kind of quality that's distinct from what it started out as. And I guess I was thinking of that as one way to think about opacity. So let me think of some examples of opacity, like, well, let's synthesize this with the last question, I guess. Let's say I'm walking down the street and I'm trans and someone thinks I'm cis, and then I speak and it reveals that I'm trans to them, or they notice it somehow. This is some kind of like unknown thing that suddenly they know, right? And suddenly it's revealed to them that they had been kind of like projecting or filling in this known thing, and it has turned out to be wrong. But the important thing is, if that thing had remained unknown, the same, it wouldn't have changed the structure of things or anything, right? I would have just avoided this one site of ranging from awkwardness to violence, right? It's a kind of like unknown that is resonating all of the known things and making them known. So for instance, if I had walked by and I spoke and the person's, I still passed or whatever, and they didn't notice, this unknown would have still remained, right? I would still be trans. It's just that suddenly the system that they were using would have, the system of analysis they were using wouldn't have failed. It would have worked. So in that moment, when suddenly they recognize the system fails, right, it often articulates itself or acts as a kind of permission to enact violence to maintain the system. And so it's a lot easier than saying, maybe my system doesn't work, right? To just be like, well, let's get rid of the outlier, or what's perceived as an outlier. But in fact, it is that so-called outlier, that body, that interior, that space, that resonates the whole thing. You can't get rid of it, or you're left again with this, you know, something that doesn't sing. Cool. Yeah, absolutely. It's difficult to speak about. There's something about the talk format in general that's difficult in this way, because Yeah, I like examples, and as is maybe obvious by the many examples, but it's hard to find right examples outside of some kind of communication. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you, Jos. Thank you for your work, your attention, your time, and your care in creating this evening with us.
Of course.
So I suppose we'll open the chat for a brief minute or two. So anyone who can wishes to express accolades or say hi, etc., can do so. And yeah, I want to thank you all again for being here. And our final events of the season are next Monday, December 7th at 8 p.m. We have Hafiza Getter and Ricardo Alberto Maldonado. And then on Wednesday, December 9th at 8 p.m., our final event of the season proper is Matilda Bernstein Sycamore in conversation with Maggie Nelson in celebration of Matilda's latest book, The Freezer Door. And yeah, thank you all for coming, and cheer if you would like to.